Okay, so why, you might ask, a course on evil? Why am I teaching a course on evil? I might well ask, why are you taking a course on evil? My reason for teaching it is this. If you look at the titles of some of the other courses in Thinking Matters or in other parts of the university, they're called things like The Art of Living, The Good Life, Justice, Global Justice, Happiness. Between you and me, I don't know whether any of that stuff exists. But evil is reliable. Evil you can count on. It's always there for you. I turn to history, and you find evil people and evil action throughout history. I turn to, yes, 70s. Turn to today. You find evil people and evil actions. I'm sadly, and Dr. Hautaler is there. So he made it through the vicissitudes of Bart. Sadly enough, if you turn on the news almost any day, and you will find something really quite appalling on the news. Arguably, you will find refugees fleeing genocide as I speak. So today I'm going to say something about philosophy, give you an overview of the course, and then start on its main theme. Most of the texts we're going to read are philosophical. I'm a philosopher, so I'm going to teach philosophical texts. So probably you've had little experience with philosophy, and it's not taught in most high schools. If it's occasionally taught in the more shishi high schools, the higher-priced private high schools, it's not taught the way it's done at the university level. And so one important thing that I hope that you learn during this course is that philosophy is an activity. It is not a bunch of dogmas. It's not a bunch of truths. It's something that you do. And part of what you will learn to do in the course is how to do philosophy. And the teaching fellows will help you do this. A second crucial thing about philosophy is that its basic concern is with finding and evaluating reasons for our beliefs. That's what it's concerned to do. To simplify slightly, it's all about finding good reasons for believing one thing rather than another. It's all about making and evaluating arguments. In order to do this, you must have some understanding of logic, which is the science of proof. Here we only present it informally and as much as we need, and that's why we ask you to read the logic section on the website and to take the exercise. The teaching fellows will probably discuss some of this material in section and answer your questions about it. My lectures will simply assume that you thoroughly understand the material that was presented on the website that we ask you to read, and the validity exercises will help you check to see that you do. If you do well on the validity exercises, yes, you have indeed mastered the material. If not, go back and look at the material that you did not get right. What we will try to do is to be as clear and precise as we can, and sometimes we will sketch out arguments step by step. I think you will find these are valuable tools. They will help clarify your own thinking and are immensely valuable in that respect. Think about whether you find them valuable during the course of the quarter as you use them. And what philosophy does is it seeks to understand two things. First, what we think about some fundamental questions. And secondly, what the most plausible or reasonable answer is to these questions. Now, you might think, okay, I see the second one's hard. Do people have free will? Are they morally responsible? That's a toughie. It may be hard to figure out a reasonable answer to this. But the first one, figuring out what you think about whether people have free will or morality is objective or subjective, that seems easy. And all you have to do is introspect. Ask yourself, hey, do I think morality is objective? Something pops into your head and that's your answer. If I convince you of nothing else, during this quarter, what I deeply hope to convince you of is it is far harder to say what you think than you now think it is. And you will find that by the end of the course, and you're often uncertain about what you think, don't know your own minds, and that is going to be philosophical progress. It's harder than you think to find out what you think. The point, let me say something about the point of the lectures and the point of the discussion sections. In lecture, I will provide some historical and intellectual context for the authors that we read, and the main themes of the reading, concepts needed for analyzing the texts, an interpretation of what we're reading, the author's main conclusions, some of the arguments for them, worries that you might raise about the argument, tensions within the text, and connections with other authors that we're reading. And so that's what I'm going to offer you in the lectures. Given the time constraints of lectures, and as you will see, we can't do a lot of close reading of texts, and there's not enough time. You will do more of this in section. And as you will see, there's often more than one reasonable interpretation of a passage. Historians of philosophy, such as myself, I'm in fact a historian of ancient philosophy. Great dead Greeks are what I work on, what I do my research on. It puts bread in my furry daughter's mouth, or actually kibble in her furry mouth, to come up with differing interpretations of particular passages. That's my bread and butter. Well, I'm a vegan, so no butter. But that doesn't mean anything goes. There may be more than one reasonable interpretation. Some interpretations, though, are just lousy. And we can try to recognize what the lousy ones are. And for some types of argument evaluation, if you explicitly spell out the steps, and it's easy enough to see if you make an error in logic. And about these, there is, more or less, no debate. Not really open for debate. Modus ponens. Modus, where's my red dot? There. It's a rather small red dot. Modus ponens. If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. This is a valid argument. This is your friend. Modus ponens is your friend. Like all your friends, use modus ponens. You will find him helpful. On the other hand, an argument of the form, if P, then Q, Q, therefore P, beep. This is known as the famous fallacy of affirming the consequent. It ain't no valid argument, and you should be able to assure yourselves of that. You need not trust me. These are just facts of the matter about modus ponens and the fallacy of affirming the consequent. There's no real debate about them. Lectures and section fit together like two parts of a jigsaw puzzle. Like peanut butter and jelly, like soy milk and cookies. They complement each other. You really need to go to both to get the most out of the course. And of course, you're responsible for everything that goes on in each. And if I make an argument about a text or a claim, or your teaching fellow does, then you're responsible for knowing that. If I argue that this argument of Hobbes doesn't work because of this counterexample, then if you write a paper on the issue, you can't just assume the argument works. You never have to agree with my claims or those of a teaching fellow, but you have to know what they are, and if you reject them, you have to give a reason for rejecting them. And since this isn't a logic course, you just have to use logical vocabulary in the way that it's presented on the website and treat as valid or invalid the arguments that we tell you are valid or invalid. But if you're curious, ask a question and we can explain. You don't have to take it totally on faith. But for example, you will see that true and false apply only to premises and to conclusions. They ain't no predicates of arguments, at least in here. In here, it's just nonsense to say that an argument is true or false. I'm just senseless. Similarly, valid, invalid, sound, and unsound apply only to arguments, not to premises or conclusions. So it's just nonsense in here to say that a premise is valid or a conclusion is sound. So don't say that. The slides will be up after lecture. They'll help organize the material presented. I don't put all the important material on the slide and then just read them. That would take too many slides, and it would be very, very boring. I often give you headings for what I'm talking about so you know what topic I'm addressing. I'm taking in notes. Is a skill, like any other, and the teaching fellows will give you some advice about how to do it. People are different, so not one style works for everyone, but neither writing everything down nor writing nothing down is probably the way to go. So briefly, the themes in the course. I will give you a roadmap, and then we'll plunge in and start talking about metaethics. This is going to give you a history of the Western conception of evil and some of the important uses to which it's been put, connections to other fundamental questions, including some basic questions of political philosophy. And we'll ask, does the concept of evil have any use today? How should we think about evil now? And I just turned Siri on my phone. I don't know how to avoid doing that. So. Yes, and she's giving me a transcript of what I'm saying. Great. And so theme 1, metaethics. This is coming up next. So I'll start on that in a moment. But the next thing we'll be doing after metaethics is the problem of evil, which is one of the first forms in which people in the West started reflecting on the nature and meaning of evil. I'll say more about the problem of evil in a lecture or two. But here is the basic problem. 1, if God exists, then God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. 2, if God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, then there is no evil in the world. Premise 3, God exists. Yes?
I don't understand how these are premises versus arguments. Don't you need like evidence theoretically to support these claims?
Premises are just things that you posit at the beginning of an argument. Okay. You might ask, do they have any support? But a premise as it stands is just asserted. Okay. If a step is inferred from some other step, then in parentheses to the right of it, and you put the number of the steps from which it's inferred. And the argument is the set consisting of the premises and the conclusion. Yeah, okay. And so, 3 premises, I leave you to supply the conclusion. The conclusion, as you may have worked out, and if not, can work out for yourself, is therefore there is no evil in the world. And you can get that by 1, 2, and 3 in modus ponens. Satisfy yourself of that. It's true. So that's a shocking conclusion, that there is no evil in the world. Should we accept this conclusion? Should we reject it? If we reject the conclusion and the argument is valid, and it is valid, you have to reject one of the premises. Which ones? The Judeo-Christian and Islamic tradition at least in the mainstream versions of it, all believed one. Even the non-mainstream versions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam went for three. They don't deny three. So they accept 1 and 3. That suggests that a problem premise is 2. And we will think about that when we get to the problem of evil. Second, one thing that you might do is, yes, therefore there is no evil in the world. Check to see if it's valid. Also, try substituting 3 star for 3 in the above argument and see what conclusion follows from that. And you will see why this was such a fraught argument for believers and non-believers alike. So we'll begin with this theological issue. And so even if you're not interested, and so the issue will be of interest to you if you're thinking of believing, or the existence of evil is your reason for not believing. If neither of those, I'll get to in a second, is the case, and you're just not interested in religious issues for their own sake, the influence of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam on the West has been massive and undeniable. And you just cannot understand where the West is now without realizing the connection to these 3 traditions. So even if you're not a believer or interested in religious things for their own sake, to understand where we are now, you have to understand them. And it raises some other important philosophical issues, such as those of free will. Yes, and then you.
So the final statement, therefore there is no evil in the world, is on a premises and conclusion.
Correct.
Then how is that different from the second premises, then there is no evil in the world?
Therefore, there is no evil in the world is the conclusion. The thing following the therefore is the conclusion.
And you already state in the premises the conclusion itself. No, the conclusion is very different.
In 2, it's part of a conditional. And so there's a difference between if P then Q and P. And they're not logically the same thing. Their truth conditions are different. And so it would be inelegant to take as a premise your conclusion, and that gives you trivially a valid argument. But part of your conclusion, or your conclusion can occur as part of a premise. That's not logically suspect. And indeed, given the way that logic works, purely formally, there's not going to be content in the conclusion that isn't represented somewhere in the premises. One more and then I move on.
My question was about, like, so we say that this is a problem of evil. Can we say that, like, religion actually tried to accept this and then say that and put forward the idea of a positive afterlife, so that, like, this life is actually where you will see bad things. It's not evil, but that's what you're tested on. And then, like, couldn't that be an answer that actually, like, even though it's modus ponens, it still is in a way consistent?
Well, that's one solution people have suggested to the problem of evil. This is a valid argument. So if all the premises are true, you must accept the conclusion. And so think about whether that solution to the problem of evil accepts this conclusion or denies it. If it denies it or is inconsistent with it, then you have to reject one of the premises. There is no other option. So we begin with that. We will move on to, so that's Augustine 1-2. We'll move on to what it is to be evil. We will look at that from a theological perspective, and we'll look at Milton's Paradise Lost, one of the West's great Satans. And I'll discuss one non-theological perspective on what evil is, and we'll try to analyze the concept of evil that we have. You'll try to analyze your own conception of evil people and evil actions. Theme 3, we will read Friedrich Nietzsche, The Genealogy of Morality. He is radically different from the folks that we will have read before him. Nietzsche denies the existence of God and the objectivity of morality. He's a nihilist, and he asks two great questions. Where did the concept of evil come from historically and psychologically? And B, is morality and belief in good and evil still of any value to us? Or should we just junk it? Just get rid of the notion of morality. Theme 4, are human beings naturally good or evil? We'll explore this with the help of evolutionary theory and experimental psychology, including the famous Milgram experiment and the equally famous Stanford prison experiment, in which many of you have scientific value at all. We'll see what that teaches us about human nature. And then we'll look at two great modern liberal thinkers, Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And since you might ask, why should we care about whether human beings are by nature good or evil? One reason to care is that the answer to that affects how we should live together. Different kinds of society, different political arrangements are appropriate and necessary given our views about human nature. And we'll see that played out in Hobbes and Rousseau. Theme 5, how should we respond to evil? We will delve more deeply into the question of how we should deal with evil at the level of a society. We'll consider the conflict between perfectionists and realists. Perfectionists think that evil can be transcended if we only change things in the appropriate way. Realists think that a good society must accept the continued existence of evil and try to channel it in good directions. So for a perfectionist, we'll read Karl Marx. For a realist, we'll read some of the Federalist Papers. And we will end with this. How should we represent evil in movies, plays, novels? Time and again, we root for the bad guy or the bad gal. We want them to get away. We root for Tony Soprano. We root for Bonnie and Clyde. Why do we do that? Why do we root for evil people in literature? And so we will end with that question. We'll end by looking at Bonnie and Clyde. So that's where we're going, and that's the roadmap to how we'll get there and how the pieces fit together. Try to keep this roadmap in mind as you do the individual readings, and I'll return to it. But now, let us get started on metaethics. And the metaethics will spill over into the next lecture, but we're now going to begin with metaethics. What is metaethics? Well, it's something higher order than ethics. And it takes ethical statements as its topic of study. And it concerns the semantics and the epistemology and the ontology of moral claims. So what do moral claims mean? How can we know them when they are true? Can we know any of them for true? And their ontology. What do they imply about being? What does the world have to be like if moral claims are in fact true? These are three central questions of metaethics, and we'll see why this is important to us. Evil is a term of morality and of value, of ethics, like good, just, unfair, and wrong. And it's akin to aesthetic terms like beautiful and ugly. And those are one set of terms. But there are also other terms, such as weighs 5 kilograms, moves at 50% of the speed of light. These terms, these latter terms, are descriptive. They tell us how the world was, how the world is, how the world will be, or how it could be. Those are descriptive terms. Moral terms and aesthetic terms are normative terms, as we'll say. And here, that they say how the world should be or ought to be. It implies a value or a standard for judging the world. Now, worries that many of you may have had already and many other people have had is, do normative properties, things like right, wrong, good, bad, beautiful, and ugly, are they really real? Do they exist as part of the world? Or are they just in our heads? Are they feelings of ours that we project onto the world? Do they just describe how we feel about the thing rather than the way the world is in itself? I think about claims like Rena weighs 50 kilograms, Rena is 1.6 meters tall. Those seem to be true or false independently of what anybody thinks about it, or the claim there is a greatest prime number. Whether you believe it or not, there's a fact of the matter of that. Doesn't matter what anybody thinks. The fact of the matter existed before humans could think about prime numbers. But are truths about right, wrong, good, bad, beautiful, and ugly like that? Or do they just depend on how we think about the world? Mass and length, people will say, are out there in the world. They're independent of how we think about the world. They're objective, and I'll say more about that next time. Things like just, unjust, good, bad, some people think are subjective. Others think that they're objective. That's a dispute we're going to talk about, and it's a dispute that's central to metaethics. And so, here is one argument, and one very basic, fundamental, and important argument that you should think about. Premise one, and it's rational to believe that X exists if and only if there is scientific evidence for the existence of X. Premise two, it is not the case that there is scientific evidence for the existence of moral properties. Therefore, it's not the case that it's rational to believe that moral properties exist. This is a drastic conclusion. If that conclusion is right, then nothing really is just, unjust, fair, unfair, good or bad. It's just not the case. Pick anything you like. It's just not just or unjust. Why? Because there just ain't no such thing as moral properties. If you don't like this conclusion, you must reject one of the premises. Why? Because this is a valid argument. And in particular, it's a biconditional. And I tell you what a biconditional is there. The website told you as well. And from that, you can prove that this is a valid argument. And I remind you what an argument is, what a valid argument is. It's not possible that all of the argument's premises are true and the conclusion false. From that and the definition of biconditional, and you can see that this is a valid argument. Work this out at home if it's not apparent. So if you don't accept the conclusion, think about what premise you want to reject. In other words, if you don't believe the argument is sound, argument one is, as a matter of fact, valid. Promise. Is it sound? Well, it's sound only if it's valid, all of its premises are true. Do you think all the premises to this are true? That is one exercise that I ask you to conduct at home before, and you can talk about in section. Next time, we will consider responses to this argument. But this is a very drastic argument. If this argument is right, all of morality goes. Morality is just like stories about Santa Claus or the tooth fairy. And we used to think there was a Santa, we used to think there was a tooth fairy. Sorry, just ain't such. If this argument is right, morality is just in the same boat with Santa and the tooth fairy. And 1 and 2 offhand don't seem crazy premises. So think about which one you want to reject. Next time, we will see those who defend a conception of morality which sees it as subject to the standards of science and insists that it's objective. We'll also see attempts to understand morality as subjective. And I'll say a bit more about what those mean in a minute. On the next slide, I give you an easy quiz, and you can look at that at home or just looking at it now. And take to account of 5, 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000, 4, 1,000, 5, 1,000. And see if you can answer both those questions and see what the correct answer to them is. Back to this. If you accept argument 1, and lots of people do, Nietzsche accepts argument 1. I think. Many others do. If you accept argument 1, then it's very natural to be a nihilist. And that is to think no moral claims are true and no moral properties exist. Morality is no more real than Santa Claus. So there are two extreme choices. One is that morality is in fact objective, and we can have good evidence for it, and it's out there in the world. That's one view. Another view is nihilism, which claims that morality claims to be objective, it's not objective, so therefore it just doesn't exist. One thing that people talk about in metaethics is which of these should we believe, or is there some other option? And that I will say a bit more about next time. Argument 1, again, I urge you to think about, perhaps talk about, reflect on. It's not a silly argument. It's not a trivial argument. It's a deep and fundamental worry about the very nature of morality. If we don't have some answer to argument 1, then we should endorse the conclusion, and we should simply give up on the project of making moral judgments. And we should stop saying things are fair, unfair, just, unjust, since all these are going to be false. Here are some reading questions for next time. I always will give you reading questions for next time. Since we still have about 5 minutes, let me say a little bit more about metaethics. Having introduced metaethics very briefly, let me say why we're talking about it. And I will say more about metaethics next time. But why am I talking about metaethics to begin this course on evil? Here's why. We're talking about issues involving morality. And we can ask, is this action or that action evil? What kinds of people are evil? Conformists, those who love the bad for the sake of the bad, and who do evil just because it's evil, those who love the per se malum, etc. But we can also ask about the status of these questions. What is the status of morality? Does it really exist? And we've seen that nihilists deny this. These are deep and important questions, but they're not the fundamental questions of this course. I'm going to say enough next time in the first half of the lecture to acquaint you with some of the central aspects of the issue, with why there's a worry, and with the main positions and some of the arguments for them. I won't cover all of them. And contemporary philosophers disagree very sharply over these issues. Some of our authors take positions on these issues, and for none of them is it the central issue that they work on. And that's okay, you can't work on everything. But for some of them, it's very important to them what metaethical claims are true. And we'll see that when we turn to them. It's very important to Hobbes. It's very important to Nietzsche. It's very important to Rousseau. It's very important to Marx. And it's very important to the Federalists. And probably some of you, and even if you don't realize it at the moment, have meta-ethical views. Some of you may be attracted in particular to something, some form of relativism. And I will go on to talk about relativism next time. But, okay. The question that we will discuss further next time is evil and good are moral terms. But moral terms have seemed problematic in many ways that scientific terms don't. Why? Well, is morality objective? Is it subjective? Is it just an illusion? Once we thought there's a Santa, now we don't. Once we believed in ghosts, now most of us don't. Once we believed in witches, now most of us don't. Maybe I should qualify that most since I'm in Northern California. Many people don't believe in witches, even in Northern California. Is it the case that moral properties are like this, that there's just something that we've made up, projected onto the world, nothing's really just or unjust, good or evil? Several of the people that we're reading think this. Now, one important question here is morality objective or subjective? I've said this several times, and you may even have talked about this at some point in your life. I mean, people often argue about, is this claim objective or is it subjective? Often these disputes go nowhere. Why do they go nowhere? Because objective and subjective are these highly general words that people often say. But when they say it, what is in their heads when they say it? What meaning do they attach to the words? What's in their heads? Usually, a dull hum. The people don't usually attach any meaning to the words. They give them no determinate sense. And that makes it extremely hard to decide whether something is objective or subjective. If you don't attach determinate meaning to your words, how can you tell if you're disagreeing with someone or agreeing? You really can't. You have to try to attach some determinate sense to the words. So, I give you here a definition of objective, or a characterization of objectivity. I claim P is objective if and only if whether P is true or false depends only on the way the world is, independently of our beliefs and attitudes. I then give you some examples of objective beliefs. 2 + 2 is 4. 2 + 2 is 5 is also objective. It's just objectively false. Subjective claims: a vanilla soy latte is tasty, gold is worth more than $100 an ounce, recreational use of methamphetamines is illegal in California. Sorry. These depend on the way that we think about the world, how we perceive it, our desires, intentions, and so on, in a way that the first ones don't. The question that we will be considering, the first part next time, is morality objective or subjective? People often say this is the common sense view of the world. Ask yourself of morality, is it your view of morality? And it has been for a very long time a common view. Plato, Aristotle, and Rousseau held it. Ask yourself, do you think morality is objective? If not, should we just become nihilists? Are these the only options? We will begin here. Next time with metaethics, we then turn to Adam and Eve in Genesis and the wonderful Adam and Eve story and Augustine. And I give you reading questions for Augustine. So I will see at least some of you, I hope, next time, if you don't all run away in terror after the first lecture. So when you file out sorry, could you leave your cards here? I will then pick them up and read them after lecture, and I'll answer 3 or 5 of them next time.